Okay, so now we're moving on to the macro outlook in part 3. So central banks have not finished with rate hikes yet, as we found out last week, despite the Fed taking a little break the week before. But inflation remains far from beaten. You know, it's not that it's just sticky, but I could see that there's potential for it to increase a little bit, and that's regardless of all these interest rate hikes. Um, you know, and again, uh, the central banks, I say this week in, week out, I see the central banks will be comfortable, not happy, but comfortable with a recession. So any potential recession outlook is not going to deter them, not going to make them change their policy. They're going to stick with it because they need to make sure that they beat inflation. That is their real enemy. And, you know, really the only way to beat inflation at the moment is to destroy demand, not just reduce demand, but destroy it. And that will take a recession. And of course, I believe it's corporate greed that's keeping inflation higher than it should be. Yeah, and you can see that when, you know, all you've got to do is compare CPI with PPI, really. Now, firms are not dropping prices to attract consumers, which has happened in the past. They would rather actually increase prices so that they sell less goods, but that does offset the fact that, you know, they're selling less, so they're just going to charge more so that they maintain or potentially even increase their profit margin. You know, and you've got to remember they're at decade highs at the moment. And of course, when we look at the interest rate pauses, maybe, and for how long? Because unless that inflation really does get down to that target 2%, some countries just not going to have any choice. Some central banks, certainly, such as the ECB and the Bank of England, they really don't have a choice but to hike more. Now, Powell's testimony remained hawkish, and, as I keep writing and keep saying, they're not frightened of causing a recession. They've got a template how to stimulate an economy. They did it through the subprime. They did it through COVID. But they've got nothing when it comes to beating inflation. And of course, again, as I've mentioned before, I'm really not a big believer in QE. I don't believe that's the best way to stimulate an economy anyway. It's just the easiest. Now, supply chains, they do continue to improve. The only concern for me is that Russia did state that they were not willing to renew the agreement allowing Ukraine to export grains after the 2-month extension expires across that corridor. However, which is quite interesting, Russia does expect to be allowed to continue with their exports. How does that one work? Now, oil prices sort of fluctuated in about a $5 range last week. Pretty much on 1 or 2 days it did the whole thing, and they remain under pressure. You still got sort of at the moment a high around about that 72 and a half where resistance is coming in, and we've got support probably around about 67, possibly down to about 65. But I just their OPEC plus cut again, that's the question, because they're certainly not getting the results that I'm sure they sort of expected or want. Unemployment's destined to continue to increase, and Powell even commented that the jobs available to unemployed ratio has dropped from that sort of record high of 2 to 1, 2 jobs for every 1 person unemployed. It's now down to about 1.6 to 1. And I do expect unemployment to increase in certain sectors, definitely. Others might take a little bit of time. And of course, that will help to identify the likelihood of a recession. The big question is how deep or long. And of course, at the moment, that's all going to be pretty unclear. We're just going to have to wait and see. But, yeah, and then I've got to come back to crypto because it enjoyed a great week. Bitcoin broke 31,000 after BlackRock put that application in for a Bitcoin ETF. And as I did mention before, in part 2, they have a great track record when it comes to being approved. So, it's going to be interesting to see how the SEC decides to go with that, because they're definitely not fans of crypto, especially the way they're sort of attacking the crypto exchanges. Now, the final point to that, I suppose, is that, Powell was questioned regarding the oversight of local government offices that are considering issuing some form of digital tokens themselves. So, again, is this a way to sort of make sure they've got more control by sort of removing a lot of the crypto? I don't know. I've got my own ideas, but I'm just not going to share them at the moment. So anyway, that's the end of the macro outlook for this week. Now we're going to move on to the technical analysis in part 4. So I hope you'll join me for that. Again, there's our services.